October delivered a cruel joke. A relentless, soaking misery disguised as a golden, crisp season. James Halloran gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up '87 Dodge Ram Charger, a beast he called the Behemoth, his knuckles white against the dark, cracked plastic. He pushed through the saturated heart of Virginia, following the winding, neglected ribbon of Old Highway Number 9. The air was thick and heavy, smelling not just of rain and wet earth, but also of a faint, acrid bitterness, like cooled, spent engine oil mixed with ancient rust. The wipers of the Ram Charger struggled. They scraped a ragged arc across the grimy windshield, barely holding back the deluge that hammered the asphalt. This was the kind of road that civilization elected to ignore, a casualty of modernity lying just far enough west of the interstate to be forgotten by mapping satellites and commuter traffic alike. The pavement was harsh and pocked, giving the Dodge a bone-jarring rattle that resonated up through James's spine. He was not here for smooth riding. He was here for the unusual, the places the smooth roads skipped. James, a documentarian whose niche was the forgotten corners of American decay, felt the familiar mix of frustration and fierce, almost predatory anticipation. His thoughts were a running ledger. 364-gig high-speed memory cards remained, plenty for one decent haul. He planned the logistics of the next profitable location. He needed something visceral, something that screamed of history and neglect, not just another ghost town cliché. Most of what he found so far were pathetic, leaning gas stations with dusty, defunct pumps and mailboxes listing desperately in aggressive, overgrown tangles of kudzu. They were merely sad. He wanted unsettling. He drove slowly, perhaps 35 miles per hour, straining his eyes against the persistent, watery curtain. The outside temperature gauge on the dash, a cheap aftermarket edition, read 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to be miserable, not cold enough to stop the world from smelling perpetually of wet dog and decomposing leaves. Then, just as the road snaked between two low, forested hills, where the fog had settled like a heavy, forgotten bedsheet, the town appeared. It did not announce itself with a welcoming sign or a sudden burst of commercial signage. There was no global positioning system marker pinging a destination. It was simply there, an unanticipated cluster of warped, graying wooden buildings. They stood hunch-shouldered in the gloom, their facades silent about the last time anyone bothered with a coat of paint, or even a simple repair, perhaps since the 1930s. The town was small, perhaps 2 blocks deep, clinging precariously to the shoulder of the old highway. The silence was immediate and absolute, a physical pressure against his eardrums. James had driven into an area radar ignored. It was a positive presence, a crushing weight that muffled the world outside the truck's cab. The only sound that dared to interrupt this profound stillness was the steady, rhythmic thump-tap-thump of heavy raindrops hammering the tin roof of the Dodge. He slowed to a crawl, navigating the main street, which was barely wider than a country lane. The buildings were mostly shuttered, a dusty barber shop, a general store whose windows were so filthy they looked like solid slabs of slate. The silence signaled an abrupt, deeply prolonged abandonment, as if everyone had decided one Tuesday afternoon to lock the doors and walk away, leaving their histories intact. And then, in the very heart of this cold, wet stupor, on the corner where a single street lamp fought a losing battle against the encroaching twilight, stood the shop. It was distinct. Unlike its neighbors, the structure was not purely black with decay, but the wood of its frame was saturated dark by countless years of moisture. Only one window glowed, radiating a strange, deep amber light, a color that felt unnaturally warm against the backdrop of the bleak October gray. Above the entrance hung a faded, nearly illegible wooden board, weathered to the point of being soft. James craned his neck and squinted through the rain-streaked glass to make out the ghostly script, Hollow's Curiosities and Oddities. That muted, almost intimate light drew him in, promising something more compelling than any manufactured sensation he had chased before. He felt a sudden physiological itch, a physical demand to stop the truck, to step out of the dry cocoon of the cab and breathe in that ancient, moist air. This was it. This was the texture he needed, the undeniable core of the town's secret. He pulled the Dodge over, the heavy tires crunching gravel on the shoulder. Killing the engine felt like turning off the town's last link to the 20th century. The silence returned, deeper now, punctuated only by the persistent drip of water from the Dodge's rain gutters. James grabbed his waterproof jacket and his camera bag, the heavy Nikon inside feeling suddenly less like a professional tool and more like an essential anchor to reality. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man approaching something sacred or something deeply cursed. As he reached the narrow porch, he noted the square brass plaque affixed to the door, hanging at a strange, unsettling angle. The inscription, etched in swirling cursive, read, "Open to those who seek truth." The phrase was a cliché, but spoken by this specific, forlorn place under the sickly amber light, it sounded less like an invitation and more like a definitive judgment. It was a sign not of commerce, but of a transaction far more fundamental. James paused before knocking, absorbing the atmosphere. He felt the cold of the damp wood radiating through the thin leather of his glove. The air around the doorway carried a faint, sweet hint of ozone, like the air right after a lightning strike. The dread was quiet, conversational, settling deep into his stomach alongside the cold. This place was not just old. It felt used up, and waiting for the next user. He took a deep, shaky breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He was ready to know what truth this place held. He pushed the heavy wooden door open. James pushed the door inward. It did not creak or scrape. It yielded with a quiet, respectful sigh. Attached to the jamb, suspended by a length of tarnished silver chain, a tiny brass bell gave off a single high-pitched, delicate chime. In the deathly quiet of the forgotten street outside, the sound was unnaturally sharp, piercing the heavy silence like a needle. The air inside hit him immediately, a heavy, layered presence that felt dense enough to swim through. It was a complex, musky mixture. The profound smell of aged leather, the dry sweetness of old institutional incense, and a subtle, unsettlingly metallic note, not of iron, but a residual tang, like blood meticulously scrubbed away, leaving only the ghost of its presence. The space was packed tight, filled from the worn floorboards to the low ceiling. The ceiling itself was dominated by massive, dark oak beams, stained almost black with age, suggesting a weight the structure bore for centuries. The interior was a claustrophobic wonder, a visual riot of the uncatalogued. Shelves, warped into shallow, concave bows under the burden of their contents, held objects that possessed no commercial value or easy identification. James, the cold-eyed observer, saw taxidermy birds whose glass eyes held an unnatural, unsettling gleam, stacks of yellowed maps that depicted no recognizable continents or countries, and fragile crystal-like masks whose eye sockets looked not merely empty, but actively alive. There were small, tarnished silver boxes that smelled faintly of cinnamon and regret, and rows of books whose titles were written in a script James did not recognize, bound in hides that felt too thin and too soft. He moved slowly down a narrow aisle, the floorboards groaning a deep, rhythmic welcome beneath his boots. Every single object vibrated with its own dense history, its own coiled narrative. James, accustomed to the clinical, dispassionate cataloging of artifacts, placing them in the safe, quantifiable realm of pixels and captions, felt something entirely different here. This was not static history. It was a rhythmic, pulsing energy, a latent life that defied categorization. His fingers, betraying his usual professional distance, involuntarily gravitated towards a small, heavy bronze amulet shaped like a closed fist. The moment his skin made contact, he jerked back. The metal was actively, sharply hot, as though it had just been pulled from a slow fire. A sudden, alarming heat that faded the moment he withdrew his hand. He backed up until he reached the heavy, plank-built counter, which looked like it remembered not merely one war, but several centuries of them. Behind this barricade sat the shopkeeper, Mr. Hollow. The man's skin was the color and texture of ancient parchment, taut and deeply lined, stretched tightly over a fragile frame. He looked 100 years old, yet his stillness was not the stillness of frailty, but of profound, unnerving patience. But his eyes, they were the true anomaly, the center of the shop's strange physics. They were pure, cold, undiluted silver, reflecting the amber light of the single hanging lamp, not with a simple glare, but with their own fierce internalized radiance. They held the light captive. Hollow did not move, did not offer a greeting, nor did he ask the standard shopkeeper's questions about intentions or specific merchandise. He simply watched James. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was profoundly penetrating, a dry, abrasive sound, like the rustling of brittle, winter-killed grass. "You are here because you were called, Mr. Halloran. I see it in the way you hold your camera. It is your shield, is it not?" James flinched internally. He had not introduced himself, and he had not spoken a word. He nervously adjusted the strap of his heavy Nikon, the weight a comforting reassurance against the sudden, cold leap of his heart. The compulsion to document this place, to translate the irrational into the safe, verifiable language of pixels, was overwhelming. He needed to prove with undeniable clarity that this man and this shop existed in the world he understood. He lifted the camera, bringing the silver eyes into sharp focus through the viewfinder. He was framing the shot, preparing to release the shutter when Hollow tilted his head. An almost imperceptible movement, but one filled with absolute authority. "Not here," the old man rasped. "The things in this place are meant to be seen not with the eyes, but with what lies beneath them. I show you what cannot be photographed. Things that are truth, not mere image." Hollow slowly reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small, heavy scale, the kind of balance a goldsmith used, made of tarnished copper and ivory. He placed it delicately on the counter surface. "But entrance demands payment," Hollow continued, his eyes catching the light again. "A fee for the truth. This is not a threat, Mr. Halloran. It is merely the fundamental law of economics in this particular establishment." James found his tongue, thick and dry. "What kind of payment are we talking about? Cash? Credit card?" Hollow allowed the faintest shadow of a smile to touch his parchment lips. It was a cold, non-human expression. Cash is ephemeral. Credit is illusion. We trade in something far more durable, something more difficult to relinquish. The air in the shop grew colder and the metallic tang intensified. James felt a profound, chilling certainty that whatever Hollow sought, it was not fungible. It was something he carried inside him, something woven into the very fabric of his being. The weight of his camera, his shield, suddenly felt inadequate. He knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he would return. The truth, no matter the price, was a story he could not afford to walk away from. He managed a curt nod, lowered his camera, and backed towards the door, feeling the pull of the shop dragging at his professional detachment. The chime of the bell as he exited sounded like a final, echoing affirmation of the transaction that was yet to come. James returned to the town a week later, driving the 200 miles back from Richmond, not for a potential story, but because of a thick, gnawing curiosity that had utterly dismantled his ability to focus on normal assignments. The amber light of Hollow's shop had become a constant, irritating static in his mind. He avoided his editing bay, unable to apply himself to the banal reality of corporate headshots and local fair coverage. The town, unnamed on any major map, was even more withdrawn this time. The air around it felt dense, like the humidity before a brutal summer storm, even though the temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun made a rare, watery appearance, yet it did nothing to lift the pall. He was not alone this time. Susan Martell, a local journalist whom he had contacted after cross-referencing old regional archives, waited for him. They met at the only establishment that showed signs of life, a diner attached to a gas pump whose sole purpose seemed to be reheating old coffee and providing a stage for local lethargy. The place smelled of stale grease and badly brewed Java. Susan was slight, perhaps in her late 20s, her features etched with the telltale fatigue of someone who spent years chasing insignificant local news, lost cats and school board controversies, and knew there was something far larger hiding just beneath the surface. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, her eyes darting nervously towards the window facing the highway. She spoke in a low whisper, her voice almost swallowed by the relentless humming drone of the ancient refrigerator unit behind the counter. "This shop is a trap, James," she murmured. "Not the kind with razor wire or lawsuits. It's worse. People go in there because they need to see, but they never come out the same. Some," she paused, taking a ragged breath, "don't come back at all." James tried to project his usual cynical detachment, leaning back in the cracked vinyl booth. "Small towns always have their boogeymen, Susan. Bad business deals, maybe a secret distilling operation." "No," she insisted, pushing a small, brittle clipping across the counter. It was yellowed, fragile, dating back to the 1930s. The text was tiny, mentioning the unexplained disappearance of a solitary male resident. Tucked carelessly beside it, taped with what looked like decades-old Scotch tape, was a small, grainy, black-and-white photograph. It was clearly the interior of Hollow's shop, the low beams, the cluttered shelves, and behind the counter, the figure of the shopkeeper. He looked 30 or 40 years younger in the picture, but the posture was identical, the stillness complete. And the eyes, even in the poor resolution, caught the light with an unnerving silvery intensity. "That photo is from the same era as the article," Susan whispered, leaning close. "He doesn't age. Or he's replaced constantly. The locals, the ones who haven't moved or ended their path, they have a myth." She lowered her voice further, requiring James to lean in until he could smell the faint, clean scent of her shampoo over the pervasive coffee stench. She spoke of the local lore, stories only shared after enough cheap whiskey had been consumed to make the truth bearable. "The shop doesn't take money, James. It takes justification. The payment is always the same, your most cherished memory. The moment of purest, unadulterated happiness. That's the fee for entry into the truth." James felt a genuine shock. Not because he believed in the supernatural, but because the concept was horrifyingly effective. To barter with nostalgia with the untouchable core of one's identity, it was a far more elegant form of extortion than mere cash. He tried to rationalize, muttering about local con artists, elaborate psychological scams, or perhaps a localized strain of severe dementia affecting the elderly population. He was a professional cynic. He looked for corruption or a hidden illicit enterprise, not metaphysical ledger entries. Yet the phrase had taken root. Justification. He thought of his own life, a solitary pursuit driven by the lens, defined by the capture, not the experience. What was his moment? He thanked Susan, leaving a few dollar bills on the sticky counter for his untouched soda. She watched him go, her silver-gray eyes filled with a deep, weary sorrow that was far older than her years. He knew she believed it. And worse, as he walked back toward the Ramcharger, he realized he did not actively disbelieve it anymore. His internal struggle was agonizing. If he knew the price, he still had to pay it. He needed proof that the payment was real, that the exchange was not a metaphor. He needed the frame, the capture, the ultimate document. He did not get back in the truck. He walked straight down the main road, the asphalt rough beneath his boots, towards the unwavering amber light. As he reached the shop's doorway, he stopped. The brass plaque, the one that read "Open to those who seek truth," was gone. But he heard a voice, not Hollow's dry whisper, but a deep, resonant sound that originated in the marrow of his bones. A compelling internal sound that was not spoken in the air. "Enter. You have something to give." He pushed the door. The chime of the bell was quiet, high, and immediate. A sound of finality. And then, the silence that followed was absolute. A perfect vacuum of sound that pressed painfully against his eardrums. He had crossed the threshold, and he knew with chilling certainty that the inventory of his soul was about to be checked. Inside, the shop was darker than before, the amber lamp conserving its light, pulling the shadows deeper into the cluttered corners. The air was noticeably cooler, perhaps 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the external temperature was mild for late October. This time, Hollow looked less like an ancient proprietor and more like a focused, terrible machine. His posture was straighter, his silver eyes fixed entirely on James. The usual aroma of old musk and metal receded, replaced by a clean, sharp scent that made James's sinuses ache. Hollow did not wait for James to speak. He simply gestured with a skeletal hand toward a spot on the counter where a dusty globe usually rested. The glass vitrine was empty. "You desire to see," Hollow rasped, the sound like sandpaper on bone. "Then see." The moment the words left the man's mouth, the shop began to hum. a low-frequency vibration that James felt in the soles of his boots. The layered smells, the leather, the incense, the faint metallic tang, receded entirely. They were supplanted by something overwhelming. The sweet, dizzying fragrance of freshly mown grass and the oddly comforting chemical tang of cheap modeling clay. The solid oak walls of the shop began to lose definition. They did not dissolve or crumble. They simply became transparent, transforming into immense, seamless panes of glass. James was suddenly bathed in a bright, unforgiving light. He stood, but he was also 7 years old, squinting against the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun. He was in the playground of his old elementary school. The vision was so acute, so sensory, that he felt the rough, splintered wooden handle of his first real camera, a bulky, second-hand Zenith, clutched tight in his small hands. Standing beside him was his mother. She was laughing, the sound warm and full of genuine, unrestrained joy. She wore the faded blue denim jacket he remembered so clearly, and she reached down, her fingers warm and familiar, to adjust the collar of his shirt, a nervous habit she never quite broke. This was the moment. He was 7. He had just won the school's amateur photography contest with a blurry, overexposed shot of a fire hydrant, and she was overflowing with pride. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph and profound, unconditional love. No ambition, no cynicism, just the dazzling simplicity of being seen and loved completely. He felt the euphoria physically. It was not merely a recalled memory. It was a present reality. The warmth of her touch, the sharp scent of her cheap drugstore perfume, the way the late spring sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair. It was so real that James took a heavy, involuntary step forward, reaching out a shaking adult hand to touch the image of his mother, to feel her laugh one last time. And then, with a sound like dry kindling snapping, a tiny crisp crack that originated inside his own skull, the vision imploded. He stood again in Hollow's shop. The light had returned to its sickly amber hue. The walls were solid wood, and the air was thick with the musky metallic scent. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in his chest cavity. Sweat was cold on his forehead. Hollow calmly wiped the counter with a cloth made of something silvery and non-absorbent. His silver eyes were steady, analyzing James's reaction with clinical precision. "Well?" Hollow asked, his voice low and expectant. James nodded slowly, unable to articulate the immensity of what he had just experienced. The reality of the vision was undeniable, the emotional resonance absolute. He had seen the truth of his own deepest joy. He needed to confirm the transaction. He needed to verify the payment. He closed his eyes tight, concentrating. He focused on the memory of the Zenith camera, the sun, the prize. He focused on the joy. It was all there, crystal clear. Then he focused on her, his mother. He pictured her laughing, reaching for his collar. He saw the jacket, the color of her hair, the shape of her hands, and he found nothing. He remembered the fact. He had a mother. He remembered the love, the profound warmth of the moment. But her face, the very geometry of her smile, the color of her eyes, the most precious visual artifact he possessed, had vanished, wiped clean. A cold, visceral terror replaced the lingering euphoria. The memory was gone. The most valuable currency he possessed had been spent. He opened his eyes. The shop now smelled only of ozone, sharp and sterile, like the aftermath of a massive electrical discharge. an old, dry skin. The truth had been delivered, and the price was non-negotiable. He had paid for the knowledge of the shop's power by sacrificing the very image of the woman who had first taught him how to frame the world. He stood there, hollowed out, the camera in his hands suddenly feeling heavy and useless, a broken shield. The loss of his mother's face left a cavity in James that no amount of professional activity could fill. The horror was not the pain. It was the chilling realization of the mechanism. The shop did not just suppress the memory. It extracted it, leaving a perfect, clean vacuum where the image once resided. He became obsessed. He returned to the unlisted town every few days, no longer seeking a story, but seeking comprehension. He knew he could not retrieve the loss, but he needed to understand the physics of this macabre form of commerce. The shop was only open for him. The amber light remained constant, a beacon in the perpetual damp. Susan Martell gave up trying to contact him. The few times he saw her in the small diner, she avoided his gaze, seeing the new shadows in his eyes, the kind of emptiness that signals the soul is leaking. He stopped wearing sunglasses, desperately clinging to every possible reflection of reality, afraid the world outside the shop might also dissolve into abstraction. Each subsequent visit was a new, horrifying iteration of the transaction. Hollow demanded smaller, yet more crucial, fragments. Once, Hollow showed him the trajectory of his career: gleaming magazine covers, international recognition, the precise angle of a light that would win him the Pulitzer Prize. When the vision snapped away, James found that his ability to perceive the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the unique vision that defined his photography, was gone. It had become flat, mechanical, purely technical. He had lost his artistic inspiration, sacrificed to the illusion of future glory. Another time, while James distractedly tried to frame a shot of a strange taxidermied owl with disproportionately large yellow eyes, Hollow offered him another gift. "Knowledge is often cold comfort, Mr. Halloran," Hollow whispered, "but it is always truth." Hollow showed him the truth of another man's deepest desire, a momentary glimpse into the future of a victim, but only at the precise moment of their own elimination. The vision was brief, a flash of terrible, suffocating darkness, and the chilling sound of air being drawn across sharp edges. James stumbled out of the shop that night, not with the memory of the sight, but with a solid, undeniable piece of personal knowledge. He knew with the chilling certainty of mathematical law that his own path would end within the next 3 years, in a moment of utter banality: electrocution caused by a catastrophic short in a malfunctioning bath unit. The knowledge was devastating. Reality had fractured completely. He knew the truth, but that truth was not liberating. It was a chain forged from his own discounted past. He began avoiding bathrooms altogether, taking military showers in the kitchen sink. He suffered from insomnia, lying awake in cheap motels, cursing the irrational gravitational pull of these rooms that housed his own demise. Every flicker of the lights, every humming appliance was a reminder of the mechanism set in motion by his own curiosity. The walls of the shop breathed along with him now, their dark wood shifting subtly. The objects on the shelves were mutating too. The old, faded photographs he had seen earlier, pictures of past patrons, were changing. The faces within them were becoming increasingly hollowed out, stamped with expressions of profound fatigue and absolute emotional emptiness. They had paid too much far beyond the initial devastating cost. The smells inside the shop were intensifying, gaining a rank, oppressive physicality. Now, beyond the ozone and the old leather, he distinctly smelled the metallic tang, a sharp, blade-like scent that had nothing to do with the climate outside. It was a smell that penetrated the bone, cold and dry. He felt himself turning inward, becoming brittle, a professional shell holding a diminishing core of humanity. He was documenting his own erasure, trading vital aspects of his personality for sterile, terrifying foresight. He knew the inner workings of the shop, but the cost of that knowledge had reduced him to little more than a functionary, an observer without the capacity to feel the weight of his own observations. The terror was no longer creeping. It sat beside him, chatting quietly, waiting for the final, inevitable transaction. James returned once more, not because he was seeking a specific piece of truth, but because he was simply incapable of staying away. He stood before the counter, exhausted, his voice barely audible even in the oppressive stillness of the shop. "How much more can I possibly relinquish?" he asked, his voice rough, almost as dry as Hollow's own whisper. He felt like he was running on fumes, a machine with its essential lubricants drained. Hollow did not immediately answer. The silver eyes watched him, impassive, calculating. Slowly, carefully, the old man reached beneath the counter. He withdrew a silver object, about the size of an old pocket watch, but flatter, shaped like a thick medallion covered in the finest, almost invisible filigree. Hollow held it gingerly, afraid the intense cold of the metal might burn his ancient skin. "You do not understand the transaction, Mr. Halloran?" Hollow said, his voice gaining volume, shedding the whisper and becoming firm, resonant. "I do not steal. I am the mediator." The traveler arrives, sees their most valuable possession displayed, and makes a choice. Which is more essential? To retain the memory, or to gain access to the deeper truth that sacrifice unlocks? He placed the medallion on the counter, where it sat dull and heavy against the dark wood. "I am merely the custodian of the price. The recipient is not myself. The memory goes elsewhere." "Then who are you?" James demanded, the last vestiges of his self-preservation giving way to a purely intellectual fury. He had passed the point of fear. He was too consumed with analyzing the invisible mathematics of the exchange. Hollow lifted his head slowly. The silver in his eyes flared, reflecting the amber lamp with sudden incandescent brilliance. For a chilling instant, James did not see an old man. He saw something immense and alien, something predicated on profound age and terrible hunger. Behind the counter, mounted on the wall, was an old, dusty oval mirror, usually obscured by shadows and junk. Now it was brilliantly lit. And in that reflection there was no shop. There was no counter, no flickering amber light. The mirror showed a landscape of impenetrable, viscous darkness, a road of black granite stitched through with a ceaseless, roaring wind. And down that road shuffled long, formless shadows, moving without discernible purpose, yet utterly relentless. They were the discarded parts of souls, the memories deemed less valuable than truth. And Hollow's reflection in that mirror was not human. It was monstrous, a colossal ash-gray presence, matted with coarse, wiry fur. It stared back at James, not with the gentle silver light of a shopkeeper, but with predatory, incandescent yellow pupils housed within those silver irises. The mouth was long, too wide, an endless maw. It was a creature of immense, terrible power, a creature that had adopted the fragile disguise of an old, patient merchant. It was the lycanthrope, the shapeshifter, the collector, the beast that waited at the intersection of nostalgia and necessity. The realization struck James with the force of a physical blow. The old man was the cage. The beast was the mechanism. "I am the one who remembers for all those who chose to forget," the lycanthrope rasped, and long, fine fangs flashed across the old man's lips. The smell of metal in the air intensified, becoming unbearable, like fresh blood sprayed onto hard-packed snow. The room shrank, the objects on the shelves pressing in, waiting for the final decision. The truth was not just supernatural, it was primal, predatory, and intimately connected to the highway outside. The shop was a trap for the restless spirit, a toll booth on the road to ultimate knowledge. James was no longer just a customer, he was a potential component in the machine. He gripped the strap of his camera, finding no comfort in its weight now, only the cold presence of the technological artifact that had led him here. The sight in the mirror was beyond anything James had ever conceived, far exceeding the gothic dramatics of his initial internal scripting. No financial scam, no organized crime syndicate, just raw, ancient, transformative horror. He stumbled backward, knocking a stack of brittle handwritten documents from a low shelf. They scattered across the floor, ignored by the keeper. Hollow, or the entity that wore his skin, straightened, the transformation receding only slightly, leaving the chilling silver glint dominant in his eyes. He pointed a long, bony finger at the oval mirror, which now showed only the dusty reflection of the shop again, though James knew the churning darkness lay just beneath the surface. "You have accumulated enough," Hollow stated, the sound now a low growl barely contained by human vocal cords. "You have seen the truth, and you have paid for it handsomely. Only one final transaction remains." "What is it?" James choked out, automatically clutching the Nikon to his chest, the last cold artifact of his former sane life. Hollow leaned across the counter, his presence overwhelming the small space. "You choose to see what you become. You step into that reflection, through the threshold of your own ultimate truth. You become me. You will accept the stewardship of time, the eternity of trade and oblivion, ensuring that the town continues to exist and that the travelers continue to pay for their illusions." The proposition was terrifying yet morbidly compelling. To become something that remembers everything lost by others. To be the repository of every abandoned joy, every discarded ambition. For a photographer whose entire existence had been centered on fixing the fleeting moment, on preserving shadows, the offer was a gruesome, eternal form of conservation. He could not save his mother's face, but he could potentially preserve the faces and feelings of millions of others, stored in the shop's cold, vast archive. The lycanthrope continued, his voice softer now, almost persuasive. "The current vessel, the old man you knew, has served long. His own dearest memory was spent centuries ago. His path must end so the collection may continue. You are the perfect successor, James. You have the curiosity, the detachment, and the ability to process fact over sentiment." James slowly raised the Nikon. His hand against all expectation was steady. He directed the lens towards the silver eyes of the old man. The sound of the autofocus motor was a loud, startling buzz in the intense silence. He had to document this. He had to capture the transfer of power, the very moment of his ultimate decision. The image, even if unprintable, even if no one else would ever see it, had to exist. It was his final, futile act of journalistic defiance. "One last photograph," James whispered. "I must fix this. I must catalog the horror." He composed the shot, filling the frame with the ancient parchment skin and the incandescent silver eyes. He pressed the shutter release. The resulting flash was not the crisp, controlled burst of the modern electronic unit. It was blinding, a searing white, merciless explosion of light that filled the tiny shop, persisting for a painful, shocking moment. It was a flare of pure, aggressive energy, seeming to burn away the last vestiges of the rank smells and the gathering shadows. James screamed, a dry, ripping sound, as the light stripped the very vision from his retinas. He felt the camera recoil in his hands, not from the physical jolt, but from the spiritual expenditure. The light cauterized everything that was soft and unnecessary inside him, replacing it with hard, cold calculation. When the glare finally receded, he stood in profound, ringing darkness. The amber lamp shattered. The entire shop plunged into an abyss of shadow. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. He lowered the camera, shaking, waiting for the smoke to clear, waiting for the sound of the lycanthrope's voice. He was waiting for the beast to confirm the price of his final, ultimate exposure. The darkness was thicker than any he had known, yet his eyes were adjusting with uncanny speed. The cold was overwhelming, settling into his joints, transforming him from the inside out. He had paid. He had pressed the button. The exchange was complete. The silence was the first thing to return, deeper and more profound than before. Then came the faintest glow of the single amber light, flickering back to life above the counter, casting a weak, yellowish sheen over the chaos. The flash, which seemed to last an age, had been no more than a second. James lowered the Nikon. The shop was utterly still. Mr. Hollow was gone. There was no body, no evidence of struggle, not even a scatter of dust where the ancient man had been seated. Only a fine, silver-gray powder had settled lightly over the polished surface of the counter, like a layer of volcanic ash. The metallic, bloody tang of the air had been replaced by a strong, sweetish smell of ozone, the kind of sterile scent that follows a violent electrical storm or a major energy expenditure. James's consciousness was sharp, acutely focused, but terribly cold. He felt a dreadful lightness in his head, the terrifying freedom of the truly unburdened. He looked down at his camera, instinctively checking the rear screen for the image he had just captured. The screen was blank. The card was full, but corrupted. The image of the silver-eyed horror was not on the hard drive, but lying neatly on the edge of the counter, where the silver ash was thickest, was a photograph. It was a printed dry print, old-fashioned, not digital. James had no memory of taking it, printing it, or even developing it. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the glossy surface. It was a portrait. It was a photograph of himself. He was sitting behind this very counter, his shoulders slightly wider, his frame straighter, his posture possessing a terrible, patient authority. He wore the same worn, dark jacket Hollow always wore, a garment that looked tailored for a different time and a different, harder man. His face was drawn, yet young, perhaps in his early 30s. The exhaustion was there, but it was overshadowed by a chilling, profound competence. and his eyes, staring out from the glossy print, were pure, cold silver steel, reflecting the faint amber light of the single lamp, with their own internal terrible radiance. The photograph was signed on the back, the script jagged and ancient, but clearly legible. The New Keeper, Cole Ridge, 1985. James was numb. The year 1985. It did not matter. Time was irrelevant here. He felt the terrifying lightness again. He did not just understand the mechanisms of the shop. He now was the mechanism. He reached into the void where the face of his mother had resided. The space was still empty. But now, in its place, was an encyclopedic knowledge of how to mend a tiny, impossible tear in the leather binding of a 17th century incunabulum. He knew the precise, obscure recipe for a chemical bath that could preserve the smell of rain for decades. He no longer required inspiration or sentiment. He possessed pure, unsentimental expertise. He slowly walked around the counter. His movements were measured, deliberate, free of the nervous energy that had defined him. He paused where Hollow had been sitting, brushing the silver ash away from the chair. It was a tall, heavy wooden stool. He sat down. The stool was the perfect height. He looked around the shop. The objects no longer seemed menacing. They were simply inventory. He cataloged them instantly, automatically. Amulet, bronze, temperature reactive. Purpose: induces curiosity. Mask, crystalline, hollowed eyes. Function: facilitates emotional transference. He understood the shop completely. The metallic tang in the air. It was the smell of residual energy from the dimensional friction. The faint, lingering odor of the beast whose presence was only a hair's breadth away, waiting for the shift. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the room. The inventory was vast. The responsibility was eternal. He walked slowly towards the door. The brass plaque, the one that read, "Open to those who seek truth," was still gone. But as he touched the jamb, the small bell gave a quiet, familiar chime. It was not a warning now, but an acknowledgement. He stepped out of the amber light and into the damp gray evening. He did not look back. He walked towards the spot where he had left his old Dodge Ram Charger. But his gait was no longer the hurried, opportunistic stride of a photographer chasing a scoop. It was the measured, patient pacing of someone who has nowhere else to go and all the time in the world to wait. The rain had softened to a persistent, cold drizzle, and James Halloran, the new keeper, felt the cold settle in his bones, not as a discomfort, but as a necessary component of his new, eternal life. Susan Martell returned to the small, forgotten town precisely 7 days later. The intervening week had been a blur of failed attempts to reach James Halloran. His cell phone went straight to an impersonal voicemail, and his sporadic emails ceased entirely. Susan no longer chased sensationalism. A gnawing sense of profound incompletion had replaced her journalistic drive. James had been too agitated, too focused, to simply walk away from a story of this magnitude. The town was even quieter now. It was mid-morning, the sky a heavy, oppressive ceiling of gray, and the temperature hovered near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The oppressive stillness was palpable. She found James's Dodge Ram Charger parked where he had left it, near the entrance to the main street. It was locked, the key still dangling innocently from the ignition switch. She touched the cold metal of the door handle. The truck was dusty, yet strangely clean. There was very little of the accumulated road grime one expected after a week of rain and wet highway travel, almost as if it had been recently polished. A shiver of genuine unease traced its way up her spine. A man like James Halloran did not abandon his equipment, especially not a vehicle that contained thousands of dollars worth of professional gear. She walked towards Hollow's Curiosities. The amber light burned, as unwavering and unnatural as ever. The brass plaque was back in place, hanging at the strange angle. Open to those who seek truth. Outwardly, everything was exactly as the terrifying local legends described it. The cycle, she realized, looked deceptively ordinary from the outside. Susan was a rationalist who believed in human corruption, not occult mythology. But she believed fiercely in evidence. She knelt, inspecting the old, cracked asphalt in front of the shop. There was not a single fresh tire track, scratch, or scuff mark. Nothing but the clear, recent impressions left by the tires of her own compact sedan. The town had literally sealed itself off, insulating the shop from the continuous intrusion of the modern world. She forced herself to stand, squaring her shoulders. She had to know. For James, and perhaps for herself. She approached the door and pushed it open. The small brass bell chimed. It sounded clean, almost sweetly melodic, too perfect and clear for a place so steeped in decay. The air inside hit her, the familiar layers of dry age, incense, and the lingering faint metallic tang. But it was also subtly different. It felt colder, more sterilized, almost clinically controlled. Behind the counter sat a man. He was not the ancient, parchment-skinned Mr. Hollow. This man was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, lean and fit, dressed in a heavy dark field jacket that looked practical but decades out of style. He appeared weary, but his weariness was not physical exhaustion. It was the fatigue of profound, endless vigilance. Susan's breath caught in her throat. She knew the face immediately, despite the subtle changes, the severe lines around the mouth, the unexpected firmness of the jaw. But it was the eyes that truly arrested her. They were a shocking cold silver, utterly devoid of warmth, reflecting the amber light with professional detached interest. They fixed upon her as if she were merely the next antique to be catalogued, the next item of inventory to be valued. It was James Halloran, but it was a James stripped clean of every ounce of messy humanity she had seen in him. He was a flawless, terrifying construct of competence and knowledge. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant, almost inaudible drip of water somewhere in the depths of the shop. Susan stood motionless, trapped between recognition and overwhelming, primal fear, knowing that the man she had come to rescue had taken the seat of his captor. The silence was heavy, but the new keeper did not let it linger. "Are you searching for someone?" His voice was low, certainly not the dry rasp of the old man, but neither was it James's familiar, slightly abrasive baritone. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard completely on the first attempt, a sound stripped of all questioning inflection. It was an appalling sound, carrying a familiar yet chillingly distorted cadence. Susan felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up, an undeniable animal response to a predator's gaze. She recognized the precise tilt of the head, the way the light caught the ridge of his eyebrow. It was James Halloran, yes, but James with all the vital complexity squeezed out, leaving only a cold, functional core. She forced herself to speak, fighting to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Where is Mr. Hollow?" The old man who ran this place. The new keeper, James, offered a slight, chillingly controlled smile that did not touch his silver eyes. His teeth, she noticed with a jolt, were perfectly straight and unnervingly white. He slowly ran a finger over the smooth, dark wood of the counter, oblivious to the faint silver ash that still coated the surface. Mr. Hollow, James echoed, the name sounding like a mere historical footnote. He has departed. He paid what was due, completed his service. His path ended so that the continuity of the shop could be maintained. His casual delivery of the euphemism, "his path ended," made the implied violence exponentially worse. He was talking about the end of a long existence with the professional distance of a corporate auditor closing a ledger. Susan glanced frantically around the shelves. The objects were subtly reorganized. She looked for the taxidermied owl, the fragile masks. They were still there, but arranged with a chilling geometric precision. She noticed a new item among the clutter. A stack of crisp, neatly organized calling cards. They were clearly antique, and she could not read the minuscule script on most of them. But on one, tucked prominently near the front, a single line was written in a hand that looked startlingly like her own looping script, though aged and unfamiliar. The scoop. One-time access. "People arrive here, Miss Martell," James continued, leaning forward slightly. The strange odor emanating from him was an unsettling blend of very old paper and pure, high-voltage ozone. "They pay the ultimate price to see. I am merely here to ensure that the payment is correctly processed." He adjusted the heavy dark jacket he wore, a garment that was manifestly too large for his previous frame, yet somehow fit him perfectly now. "They do not leave empty-handed," he said, the ghost of a triumphant journalistic passion briefly surfacing, immediately squashed by the silver cold of his eyes. "They leave with the truth they desired. The shop is merely the archive for what they sacrificed to obtain it." Susan felt a growing, horrifying understanding. Her own presence, her persistent, obsessive desire to uncover this story, her relentless need for evidence and documentation, that was her most cherished memory. Her single defining passion was the thirst for the ultimate scoop, the untouchable core of journalistic truth. That was what the shop waited to claim. She realized, with a sinking terror that went beyond words, that James was not just a new employee. He was the physical manifestation of the transaction. He was the price of his own curiosity, transformed into the very thing that collected the price from others. The horror was not in the magic, but in the dreadful efficiency. He was trapped, and now, by witnessing him, she was being drawn into the mechanism herself. She was looking at the future of her own professional soul. James watched Susan, his silver eyes perfectly still. He calculated her resistance, measuring her remaining emotional capacity against her professional obsession. "You are here because you want to see the mechanism work," he stated, his voice flat, purely analytical. "You want to document the impossible. This is your ultimate story, isn't it, Miss Martell? The frame you cannot walk away from." Susan found she could not deny it. Her rational world was dissolving, collapsing under the oppressive weight of the amber light and the chilling, cold truth embodied by the man before her. She wanted to know what had happened to James, but more than that, she wanted to witness the full scope of his transformation, to record the exact moment where the human being ended and the custodian began. "What will I receive?" she finally managed, the question a hoarse whisper. She focused on his eyes, empty of his former restless ambition, yet brimming with a terrible, eternal knowledge. James leaned further across the counter. The strange, sterile odor was strong, like a blast of frozen air. You will receive the story. The biggest story. The one that can never be published. You will see how the world changes when a person pays the cost. You will receive the absolute, unvarnished truth about the price of human memory. He reached beneath the counter and withdrew a thick, leather-bound book. It was old, the cover deeply cracked and brittle, the same book James himself had seen in Hollow's hands during one of his earlier fateful visits. The leather felt cold like freshly excavated marble. "Take this," James commanded. "It is the ledger, the chronicle of this place. When you have finished reading it, you will comprehend the exchange. You will understand why you have already made the right choice." Susan reached out and took the book. The chill of the ancient leather sank into her own skin, a cold, irreversible claim. She opened the cover immediately. There was only one title printed on the first page, stark and black against the yellowed paper. "People are ready to give their lives to visit this werewolf shop." She looked up, intending to ask about the price, the precise currency the shop was demanding for the chronicle, for the truth. But James was gone. The space behind the counter was suddenly, impossibly empty. The tall stool was still there, but the new keeper had vanished, leaving no sound, no movement, no trace. Only the brass bell gave a quiet, lingering chime, a soft acknowledgement of her own rising terror. Susan stood alone among the thousands of silent objects, each one now a stolen, catalogued memory, a fragment of someone's forgotten past. She held the book tight, its cold weight her only anchor in the suddenly vast, echoing silence of the shop. She had the ultimate story, but the emptiness in the place where James had been seated was a terrible premonition of the final price. Susan did not leave. The shock of James's sudden departure and the cold authority of the book fixed her in place. She felt no hunger, no thirst, only an overwhelming, compulsive need to consume the knowledge bound within the leather cover. She spent 3 days within the confines of the shop. The light never changed, held perpetually in the sickly amber of late twilight. She moved to the tall stool behind the counter, the place where she felt she belonged, the book heavy in her lap. The chronicle was the comprehensive history of the town and its keepers, the chain of individuals, always driven by an irrepressible curiosity or a profound need for truth, who came to the shop seeking answers and ended up as its living archives. She read about the old man Hollow, who had once been a prosperous jeweler, sacrificing the memory of his children's laughter to gain the ultimate, to assay true value in any object. She read how James Halloran had paid with his mother's face to achieve pure observational capacity, the ability to state facts without the interference of sentiment. He had attained the pinnacle of his profession, transforming from an observer of life into a cold, perfect functionary of the shop. Susan understood her own specific, terrifying path. Her payment would be the surrender of her capacity for desire, her relentless, driving professional ambition for the truth. She would gain eternal knowledge, yes, the ability to see the world as a complex, interlocking machine. But she would lose the essential human element that made knowledge worth pursuing. The fire, the passion, the need. She would become immortal, yet utterly apathetic. The perfect, cold custodian. On the 3rd day, she closed the book. The binding felt warm now, familiar. She knew everything. The facts were organized, categorized, and accepted. There was no room left for protest or fear. She was ready. She slowly stood up and walked to the small, dusty mirror behind the counter. She looked into her own eyes. Outside, the town had sunk into the perpetual early evening gloom. Susan, the new keeper, felt a strange, chilling effulgence begin to bloom deep within her irises. It was a cold, distant sheen, replacing the anxious gray of her own eyes. She no longer felt the fatigue of her 3-day vigil or the fear of her certain fate. Only the quiet, immense weight of her new obligation. She picked up a small, antique pair of shears and a sheet of old, brittle newsprint left on the counter. With slow, painstaking care, she cut out a small rectangle, making a new calling card. On it, in crisp, elegant letters, she wrote, "Susan Martell, journalist, truth upon request." She placed the card neatly beside the silver ash. She glanced at the door. The familiar magnetic sign, the one she knew James had placed there, was glowing with a new, fresh intensity, the letters appearing to be written in living embers. Open to those who seek truth. A few minutes later, she heard the unmistakable sound of an engine slowing down outside, tires crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. A car door opened and slammed shut. Then came the sound of the shop door being pushed inward, followed by the soft, sharp, high-pitched chime of the brass bell, the sound that marked the eternal cycle of Coal Ridge. Susan lifted her head from the counter, and the silver coldness in her eyes flashed brightly in the amber light. "Welcome," she said, her voice dry and precise, like the sound of a brittle autumn leaf skittering across cold pavement. The new keeper was ready for her first transaction.